Hey everybody, this is chapter 4 of Leon Trotsky's Revolution Betrayed. What is the Soviet Union and where is it going? Chapter 4 is titled The Struggle for Productivity of Labor, Money and Plan. That's a heading. There's 4 headings. Money and Plan, quote, Socialist Inflation, the Rehabilitation of the Ruble, the Stakhanov Movement. One, money and plan. We have attempted to examine the Soviet regime in the cross-section of currency. These two problems, state and money, have a number of traits in common, for they both reduce themselves in the last analysis to the problem of problems, the productivity of labor. State compulsion, like money compulsion, is an inheritance from the class society which is incapable of defining the relations of man by man except in the form of fetishes, churchly or secular, after appointing to defend them the most alarming of all fetishes, the state, with a great knife between its teeth. In a communist society, the state and money will disappear. Their gradual dying away ought consequently to begin under socialism. We shall be able to speak of the actual triumph of socialism only at that historical moment when the state turns into a semi-state and money begins to lose its magic power. This will mean that socialism, having freed itself from capitalist fetishes, is beginning to create a more lucid, free, and worthy relation among men. Such characteristically anarchist demands as the, quote, abolition of money, quote, abolition of wages, or, quote, liquidation of the state and family, possess interest merely as models of mechanical thinking. Money cannot be arbitrarily, quote, abolished, nor the state and the old family, quote, liquidated. They have to exhaust their historic mission, evaporate, and fall away. The death blow to money fetishism will be struck only upon the stage when the steady growth of social wealth has made us bipeds forget our miserly attitude toward every excess minute of labor and our humiliating fear about the size of our ration. Having lost its ability to bring happiness or trample men in the dust, money will turn into mere bookkeeping receipts for the convenience of statisticians and for planning purposes. In the still more distant future, probably these receipts will not be needed, but we can leave this question entirely to posterity, who will be more intelligent than we are. The nationalization of the means of production and credit, the cooperation or statizing of internal trade, the monopoly of foreign trade, the collectivization of agriculture, the law on inheritance set strict limits upon the personal accumulation of money and hinder money's conversion into private capital, usurious, commercial, and industrial. These functions of money, however, bound up as they are with exploitation, are not liquidated at the beginning of a proletarian revolution, but in a modified form are transferred to the state, the universal merchant, creditor, and industrialist. So let's repeat that again. These functions of money, however, bound up as they are with exploitation, are not liquidated at the beginning of a proletarian revolution, but in a modified form are transferred to the state, the universal merchant, creditor, and industrialist. At the same time, the more elementary functions of money as measures of value, means of exchange, and medium of payment are not only preserved but acquire a broader field of action than they had under capitalism. I'm going to repeat that again. At the same time, the more elementary functions of money as measures of value, means of exchange, and medium of payment are not only preserved but acquire a broader field of action than they had under capitalism. Administrative planning has sufficiently revealed its power, but therewith also the limits of its power. An a priori economic plan, above all in a backward country with 170 million population, and a profound contradiction between city and country, is not a fixed gospel, but a rough work hypothesis which must be verified and reconstructed in the process of its fulfillment. We might indeed lay down a rule: the more, quote, accurately an administrative task is filled, the worse is the economic leadership. For the regulation and application of plans, two levers are needed: the political lever and in the form of a real participation and leadership of the interested masses themselves, a thing which is unthinkable without Soviet democracy, and a financial lever in the form of a real testing out of a priori calculations with the help of a universal equivalent, a thing that is unthinkable without a stable money system. The role of money in the Soviet economy is not only unfinished, but as we have said, still has a long growth ahead. The transitional epoch between capitalism and socialism taken as a whole does not mean a cutting down of trade, but on the contrary, trade's extraordinary extension. All branches of industry and transfer, this is a big, this is right here, is a big critique a lot of people have of, Trotsky's taxonomy. I know, like the transitional epoch or the transitional society as opposed to the transitional period. For this type of in Marxology, it's generally considered, at least by people who aren't trying to appropriate Marx for Bolshevist ends. They generally say that capitalism is the transitional epoch to socialism. There's this idea of their insisting on between a transitional epoch between a society, which is more than just a period or temporary thing, but a whole entire epoch. Is not found in the critique of the Gotha program. The transitional period is what is conceptualized as the transitional period is the dictatorship of the proletariat, but the transitional period is not yet socialism, or either, but the transitional period is not this thing that indefinitely extends into the future between capitalism and socialism. I think most people, they would say people like Paresh Chattopadhyay or Chattopadhyay or Peter Hudis or Adam Buick would say that this concept socialism is already stateless and moneyless, with labor vouchers as a possibility being a distinct thing from wages. Anyway, the transitional epoch between capitalism and socialism taken as a whole does not mean a cutting down of trade, but on the contrary, trade's extraordinary extension. All branches of industry transform themselves and grow. New branches of industry continually arise, and all are compelled to define their relations to one another both quantitatively and qualitatively. The liquidation of the consummatory peasant economy, and at the same time of the shut-in family life, means a transfer to the social sphere of social interchange and ipso facto money circulation of all the labor energy which was formerly expended within the limits of the peasant's yard, or within the walls of the private dwelling. All products and services begin for the first time in history to be exchanged for one another. On the other hand, a successful socialist construction is unthinkable without including in the planned system the direct personal interests of the producer and consumer, their egoism, which in its turn may reveal itself fruitfully only if it has in its service the customary, reliable, and flexible instrument, money. The raising of the productivity of labor and bettering the quality of its products is quite unattainable without an accurate measure freely penetrating into all the cells of industry, that is, without a stable unit of currency. Hence it is clear that in the transitional economy, as also under capitalism, the sole authentic money is that based upon gold. All other money is only a substitute. To be sure, the Soviet state has in its hand at the same time the mass of commodities and the machinery for printing money. However, this does not change the situation. Administrative manipulations in the sphere of commodity prices do not in the slightest degree create or replace a stable money unit either for domestic or foreign trade. Deprived of an independent basis, that is, a gold basis, the money system of the Soviet Union, like that of a number of capitalist countries, has necessarily a shut-in character. For the world market, the ruble does not exist. If the Soviet Union can endure the adverse aspects of the money system more easily than Germany and Italy, it is only in part due to the natural wealth of the country. Only the natural wealth of the country makes it possible not to struggle in the clutches of autarky. The historic task, however, is merely not avoiding strangling, but to create face to face with the highest achievements of the world market a powerful economy, rational through and through, which will guarantee the greatest saving of time and consequently the highest flowering of culture. The dynamic Soviet economy, passing as it does through continual technical revolutions and large-scale experiments, needs more than any other continual testing by means of a stable measure of value. Theoretically, there cannot be the slightest doubt that if the Soviet economy had possessed a gold ruble, the rest of the 5-year plan would be incomparably more favorable. The result of the 5-year plan would be incomparably more favorable than they are now. Of course, you cannot, quote, pass the impossible, end quote, but you must not make a virtue of necessity, for that leads into that in turn leads to additional economic mistakes and losses. Section 2, quote, Socialist inflation. The history of the Soviet currency is not only a history of economic difficulties, successes, and failures, but also a history of the zigzags of bureaucratic thought. The restoration of the ruble in 1922-24 in connection with the transfer to the new economic policy was directly bound up with the restoration of the, quote, norms of bourgeois right, end quote, in the distribution of objects of consumption. So long as the course toward the well-to-do farmer continued, the Chervonets was an object of governmental concern. During the, I think that's like a monetary unit, let me make sure. I mean, it would make sense if it was a monetary unit, but I don't know. Come on. Okay, here we are. Chervonets. Sorry, I spelled it wrong. Chervonets is the traditional Russian name for large foreign and domestic gold coins. During the first period of the 5-year plan, on the contrary, all the sluices of inflation were open. From 0.7 billion rubles at the beginning of 1925, the total issue of currency had risen by the beginning of 1928 to the comparatively modest sum of 1.7 billions, which is approximately comparable to the paper money circulation of Tsarist Russia on the eve of war. But this, of course, without its former metallic basis. The subsequent curve of inflation from year to year is depicted in the following feverish series: 2.0, 2.8, 4.3, 5.5, 8.4. The final figure, 8.4 billion rubles, was reached at the beginning of 1933. After that came years of consideration and retreat. 6.9, 7.7, 7.9 billion, 1935. The ruble of 1924, equal in the official exchange to 13 francs, had been reduced in November 1935 to 3 francs. That is, to less than a fourth of its value, or almost as much as the French franc was reduced as a result of the war. Both parties, the old and new, are very conditional in character. The purchasing power of the ruble in world prices now hardly equals 1.5 francs. Nevertheless, the scale of devaluation shows with what dizzy speed the Soviet valuta was sliding downhill until 1934. Valuta is the value of one currency with respect to exchange rate with another. In the full flight of the economic adventurism, Stalin promised to send the new economic policy, that is, market relations, quote, to the devil. The entire press wrote, as in 1918, about the final replacement of merchant sale by, quote, direct socialist distribution, the external sigh of which was the food card. I guess it's the external sign. It says sigh, but I think it's sign, maybe. At the same time, inflation was categorically rejected as a phenomenon inconsistent with the Soviet system. Quote, the stability of the Soviet valuta, end quote, said Stalin in 1933, quote, is guaranteed primarily by the immense quantity of commodities in the hands of the state but in circulation at stable prices, end quote. Notwithstanding the fact that this enigmatical aphorism received neither development nor elucidation, partly indeed because of this, it became a fundamental law of the Soviet theory of money, or more accurately, of that very inflation which it rejected. The chervonets, gold coin, proved therefore not to be a universal equivalent, but only a universal shadow of a, quote, immense quantity of commodities. And like all shadows, it possessed the right to shorten and lengthen itself. If this consoling doctrine made any sense at all, it was only this. The Soviet money has ceased to be money. It serves no longer as a measure of value. Quote, stable prices are designed by the state power. The chervonets is only a conventional label of the planned economy. That is, a universal distribution card. In a word, socialism has triumphed, quote, finally and irrevocably, end quote. The most utopian views of the period of military communism, which I think is war communism, were thus restored on a new economic basis, a little higher to be sure, but a loss still inadequate for the liquidation of money circulation. The ruling circles were completely possessed by the opinion that with a planned economy, inflation is not to be feared. This means approximately that if you possess a compass, there is no danger in a leaking ship. In reality, currency inflation, inevitably producing a credit inflation, entails a substitution of fictitious for real magnitudes and corrodes the planned economy from within. It is needless to say that inflation meant a dreadful tax upon the toiling masses. As for the advantages to socialism achieved with its help, they are more than dubious. Industry, to be sure, continued its rapid growth, but the economic efficiency of the grandiose construction was estimated statistically and not economically. Taking command of the ruble, giving it, that is, or various arbitrary purchasing power in different strata of the population and sectors of the economy. The bureaucracy deprived itself of the necessary instrument for objectively measuring its own successes and failures. The absence of correct accounting, disguised on paper by means of combinations with the, quote, conventional ruble, led in reality to a decline of personal interest, to a low productivity, to a still lower quality of goods. In the course of the first five-year plan, this evil assumed threatening proportions. In July 1931, Stalin came out with his famous, quote, 6 conditions, whose chief aim was to lower the production cost of industrial goods. These, quote, conditions, payment according to individual productivity of labor, production cost accounting, contained nothing new. The, quote, norms of bourgeois right, end quote, had been advanced at the dawn of the new economic policy and developed at the 12th Congress of the party at the beginning of 1923. Stalin happened upon them only in 1931 under the influence of the declining efficiency of capital investment. During the following 2 years, hardly an article appeared in the Soviet press without reference to the salvation power of these, quote, conditions. Meanwhile, with inflation continuing, the diseases caused by it were naturally not getting cured. Several measures of repression against wreckers and sabotagers did as little to help things forward. The fact seems almost unbelievable now that in opening a struggle against, quote, impersonality and, quote, equalization, which means anonymous, quote, average labor, and similar, quote, average pay for all, the bureaucracy was at the same time sending, quote, to the devil the new economic policy, which means the money evaluation of all goods, including labor power. Restoring, quote, bourgeois norms with one hand, they were destroying with the other the sole implement of any use under them. With the substitution of closed distributors for commerce and with complete chaos in prices, all correspondence between individual labor and individual wages necessarily disappeared, and therewith disappeared the personal interestedness of the worker. The strictest instructions in regard to economic accounting, quality, cost of production, and productivity were left hanging in the air. This did not prevent the theaters from declaring the cause of all economic difficulties to be the malicious unfulfillment of the 6 prescriptions of Stalin. The most cautious references to inflation they likened to a state crime. With similar conscientiousness, the authorities on occasion have accused teachers of breaking the rules of school hygiene while at the same time forbidding them to mention the absence of soap. The question of the fate of the Chervonets has occupied a prominent place in the struggle of factions in the Communist Party, the platform of factions in the Communist Party. The platform of the opposition demanded a, quote, guarantee of unconditional stability of the money unit, end quote. This demand became a leitmotif during the subsequent years. Quote, stop the process of inflation with an iron hand, end quote, wrote the emigre organ of the opposition in 1932, quote, and restore a stable unit of currency, end quote, even at the price of a, quote, bold cutting down of capital investments, end quote. The defenders of the, quote, tortoise tempo and the super-industrializers had, it seemed, temporarily changed places. I think defenders of the tortoise tempo is reference to Bukharin and the so-called right. In answer to the boast that they would send the market, quote, to the devil, the opposition recommended the State Planning Commission hang up the motto, quote, inflation is the syphilis of a planned economy, end quote. ... Well, not ... end quote, ... as in a new section. In the sphere of agriculture, inflation brought no less heavy consequences. During the period when the peasant policy was still oriented upon the well-to-do farmer, it was assumed that the socialist transformation in agriculture setting out upon the basis of the NEP would be accomplished in the course of decades by means of the cooperatives. Assuming one after another purchasing, selling, and credit functions, the cooperatives should in the long run also socialize production itself. All this taken together was called, quote, the cooperative plan of Lenin, end quote. The actual development, as we know, followed a completely different and almost an opposite course: dekulakization by violence and integral collectivization. Of the gradual socialization of separate economic functions, in step with the preparation of the material and cultural conditions for it, nothing more was said. Collectivization was introduced as though it were the instantaneous realization of the communist regime in agriculture. The immediate consequence was not only an extermination of more than half the livestock, but more important, a complete indifference of the members of the collective farms to the socialized property and the results of their own labor. The government was compelled to make a disorderly retreat. The government again supplied the peasants with chickens, pigs, sheep, and cows as personal property. They gave them private lots adjoining the farmsteads. The film of collectivization began to run off backwards. In thus restoring small personal farm holding, the state adopted a compromise, trying to buy off, as it were, the individualistic tendencies of the peasant. The collective farms were retained, and at first glance, therefore, the retreat might seem of secondary importance. In reality, the retreat's significance could hardly be overestimated. If you leave aside the collective farm aristocracy, the daily needs of the average peasant are still met to a greater degree by his work, quote, on his own, end quote, than by participation in the collective. A peasant's income from the individual enterprises, especially when he takes up technical culture, fruit, or stock farming, amounts frequently to 3 times as much as the earnings of the same peasant in the collective economy. This fact testified to the Soviet press itself. Very clearly reveals, on the one hand, a completely barbarous squandering of tens of millions of human forces, especially those of women, in midget enterprises, and on the other, the still extremely low productivity of labor in the collective farms. In order to raise the standard of large-scale collective agriculture, it was necessary again to talk to the peasant in the language he understands, that is, to resurrect the markets in return from taxes in kind to trade. In a word, to ask back from Satan, the NEP, which had been... What the fuck? Yeah, there's just a whole fucking bunch of gibberish here. Motherfucker. Anyway, God, this is fucking annoying. Anyway, Section 3, the Rehabilitation of the Ruble. The owl of wisdom flies, as is well known, after sunset. Thus, the theory of a, quote, socialist system of money and prices was developed only after the twilight of inflationist illusions. In developing the above enigmatical words of Stalin, the obedient professors managed to create an entire theory according to which the Soviet price, in contrast to the market price, has an exclusively planning or directive character. That is, it is not an economic but an administrative category, and thus serves the better for the redistribution of the people's income in the interest of socialism. The professors forgot to explain how you can estimate real costs if all prices express the will of a bureaucracy, and not the amount of socially necessary labor expended. In reality, for the redistribution of the people's income, the government has in its hands such mighty levers as taxes. The state budget of expenditures for 1936, after 37.6 billion rubles are allotted directly, and many billions indirectly, to financing the various branches of economy. The budget and credit mechanism is wholly inadequate for a planned distribution of the national income. And as to prices, they will serve the cause of socialism better the more honestly they begin to express the real economic relations of the present day. Experience has managed to say its decisive word on this subject. Quote, directive prices were less impressive in real life than in the books of scholars. On one and the same commodity, prices of different categories were established. In the broad cracks between these categories, all kinds of speculation, favoritism, parasitism, and other vices found room. And this rather as the rule than the exception. At the same time, the chervonets, which ought to have been the steady shadow of stable prices, became in reality nothing but the chervonet's own shadow. It was again necessary to make a sharp change of course, this time as a result of difficulties which grew out of the economic successes. 1935 opened with the abolition of bread cards. By October, cards for other food products were liquidated. In January 1936, cards for industrial production of general consumption were abolished. The economic relations of the city and the country to the state and to each other were translated into the language of money. The ruble is an instrument for the influence of the population upon economic plans, beginning with the quantity and quality of the objects of consumption. In no other manner is it possible to rationalize the Soviet economy. That's some, it reminds me of like Hayek's conception of, I think it's Hayek, I'm not an expert, I should be an expert, but I'm not, Hayek's notion of like the market, not just as allocator, but as an information carrier. The market kind of like, and prices impersonally determining what conveying information to producers about what consumers want in kind of like a automatic direct fashion, giving people what they really want instead of what like economic planning says they should want, or something like that. This is at this kind of notion of the there's a certain epistemic quality to the price mechanism. Anyway, not to say that, you know, Trotsky is a Hayekian, but that's what it means. That's what that last statement reminded me of. Let me repeat it, just so it doesn't. The ruble is an instrument for the influence of the population upon economic plans, beginning with the quantity and quality of objects in consumption. In no other manner is it possible to rationalize the Soviet economy. The president of the State Planning Commission announced in December 1935, quote, "Thus the superstition of administrative plan and the illusion of administrative prices were shipwrecked. If the approach to socialism means in the fiscal sphere the approach of the ruble to a distribution card, then the reforms of 1935 would have to be regarded as a departure from socialism. In reality, however, such an appraisal would be a crude mistake. The replacement of the card by the ruble is merely a rejection of fictions and an open acknowledgement of the necessity of creating the premises for socialism by means of a return to bourgeois methods of distribution." At a session of the Central Executive Committee in January 1936, the People's Commissar of Finance announced, quote, "The Soviet ruble is as stable as is no other valuta in the world," end quote. It would be wrong to read this announcement as sheer boasting. The state budget of the Soviet Union is balanced with a yearly increase of income over expenses. Foreign trade, to be sure, although insignificant in itself, gives an active balance. The gold reserve of the State Bank, which amounts to in 1926 to 164 million rubles, is now more than 1 billion. The output of gold in the country is rising rapidly. In 1936, this branch of industry is calculated to take first place in the world. I think there's a book called Stalin's Quest for Gold. I'm not sure of the content of it, but this I think maybe it's kind of a reference to this massive expansion of the gold industry in Soviet Union. The output of gold in the country is rising rapidly. In 1936, this branch of industry is calculated to take first place in the world. So, yeah, that makes sense. That would make sense, at least. I don't know enough about any of those things to say anything about them, but the growth of commodity circulation under the restored market has become very rapid. Paper money inflation was actually stopped in 1934. The elements of a certain stabilization of the ruble exist. Nevertheless, the announcement of the People's Commissar of Finance must be explained to a considerable extent by an inflation of optimism. If the Soviet ruble possesses a mighty support in the general rise of industry, still, the Soviet ruble's Achilles heel is the intolerably high cost of production. The ruble will become the most stable valuta only from the moment when the Soviet productivity of labor exceeds that of the rest of the world, when consequently the ruble itself will be mediating on its final hour. From a technically fiscal point of view, the ruble can still less lay claim to superiority. With a gold reserve of over $1 billion, about 8 billions of banknotes are in circulation in the country. The coverage, therefore, amounts to only 12.5%. The gold in the state bank is still considerably more in the nature of an inviolate reserve for the purposes of war than the basis of a currency. Theoretically, to be sure, it is not impossible that at a higher stage of development, the Soviets will restore to a gold currency in order to make domestic economic plans precise and simplify economic relations with foreign countries. Thus, before giving up the ghost, the currency might once more flare up with the gleam of pure gold, but this in any case is not a problem for the immediate future. In the period to come, there can be no talk of going over to the gold standard. Insofar, however, as the government, by increasing the gold reserve, is trying to raise the percentage even of a purely theoretical coverage, insofar as the limits of banknote emission are objectively determined and not dependent upon the will of the bureaucracy, to that extent the Soviet ruble may achieve at least a relative stability. That alone would be of enormous benefit. With a firm rejection of inflation in the future, the currency, although deprived of the advantage of the gold standard, could indubitably help to cure the many deep wounds inflicted upon the economy by the bureaucratic subjectivism of the preceding years. Section 4. The Stakhanov Movement. Quote, all economy, said Marx, and that means all human struggle with nature at all stages of civilization, quote, comes down in the last analysis to an economy of time, end quote. Reduced to its primary basis, history is nothing but a struggle for an economy of working time. Okay. This is like one of the main features of traditional Marxism right here. The notion that of like a trans-historical relationship to time that is oriented towards economizing. That's one of the things of one of the main contributions of political Marxism, and I suppose also people who emphasize the changing relationship to time, like people like E.P. Thompson. This idea that, and obviously this is kind of like seconded by like Moishe Pistone as well, whereas capitalism kind of creates a certain relation to time that creates a impersonal imperative via market pressures to reduce for producers to adequately reduce their amount of working time in order to either maintain but ideally outstrip the socially necessary labor time of that is the standard for the product being in question being produced. So I think I got that. I think that I really like. I don't really remember too much of the book, honestly, because I don't know why, but I believe it's believe it's called Capitalist Critique by Paul Maddock Jr. And he says something to the effect is like values are kind of like this thing that's like, it's produced in production, but at the same time, like a value as socially necessary labor time is kind of a social thing that exists outside of any individual productive unit. And thus, the ambition of a productive unit is to reduce their, so-called is to have an actual labor time that's beneath the socially necessary labor time. And obviously, they're not, capitalists aren't looking out for things like, how long does it take to make things? I want to make it shorter because that's against socially necessary labor time. But generally speaking, a reduction in labor time corresponds to a lowering of production costs. So if you can employ 10 workers and only need them for, pay them an hour's wage, and they produce way more in an hour than, they would produce than they produced previously, you're saving money and reducing cost, and thus becoming more competitive, be more competitive on the market, either garnishing, or not garnishing, it's taking in surplus profits, or keeping your profits the same, but then kind of like colonizing or dominating the rest of the market, using your competitive leverage to gain dominance in your particular sphere of commodities until other enterprises catch up with what you have achieved in terms of efficiency. So there's this kind of, so basically all I'm saying here is that this struggle for an economy of working time is not a transhistorical feature of social life, as Trotsky might be suggesting here, but a historically specific relation to time that stems from the impersonal forces of the law of value. Is basically what I'm saying. Anyway, socialism could not be justified by the abolition of exploitation alone. Okay. Socialism must guarantee to society a higher economy of time than is guaranteed by capitalism. Without the realization of this condition, the mere removal of exploitation would be but a dramatic episode without a future. The first historical experiment in the application of socialist methods has revealed the great possibilities contained in them. But the Soviet economy is still far from learning to make use of time, that most precious raw material of culture. The imported technique, the chief implement for the economy of time, still fails to produce on the Soviet soil those results which are normal in its capitalist fatherlands. In that sense, decisive for all civilizations, socialism has not yet triumphed. It has shown that it can and should triumph, but socialism has not yet triumphed. All assertions to the contrary are the fruit of ignorance and charlatanism. Molotov, who sometimes, to do him justice, reveals a little more freedom from the ritual phrase than other Soviet leaders, declared in January 1936 at a session of the Central Executive Committee, quote, "Our average level of productivity of labor ... is still considerably below that of America and Europe," end quote. It would be well to make these words precise approximately thus: 3, 5, and sometimes even 10 times as low as that of Europe and America, and our cost of production is correspondingly considerably higher. In the same speech, Molotov made a more general confession, quote, "The average level of culture of our workers still stands below the corresponding level of the workers of a number of capitalist countries," end quote. Molotov. To this should be added also the average standard of living. There is no need of explaining how mercilessly these sober words, spoken in passing, refute the boastful announcements of the innumerable official authorities and the honeyed outpourings of the quote of the foreign quote friends. The struggle to raise the productivity of labor, together with concerns about defense, is the fundamental content of the activity of the Soviet government. I think this is this is not just like Trotsky's opinion. I think this is actually generally considered. If you listen to the lecture by Mark Harrison, who's like, I don't know what his actual politics are. I think he has articles in Capital and Class, so I think he has like maybe like a left-wing background, and is certainly his analysis displays a lot of like very, very much serious rigor. But I don't know what his actual politics are. I think he might be something of a conservative now. I'm not exactly sure. That might be totally inaccurate. But if you look at Mark Harrison, who's kind of like featured in like every single like Soviet history textbook, and he usually has a chapter on economics. He's an economic historian of the Soviet Union, and his talk, he's like, what is the goal? What was the goals of Stalinism? What was the goal of the 5-year plan stuff? Was it to create a society of from each according to their ability to each according to their need, or even like a lower phase socialist idea from each according to their ability? From each according to their work, from each according, whatever it is, to each according to their work, as in like a lower phase of communism. And he's like, no. But the fundamental orientation of Stalinism was to become a technological powerhouse, an economic powerhouse by raising the productivity of labor, as Trotsky says here, and together to create a very strong military. Those were the fundamental drives. Then some people say, to fight fascism or something like that. But the 5-year plan started in 1929. Hitler wasn't elected until 1933. I don't believe that the fascist Italy was in any position whatsoever to launch an expansive invasion into the Soviet Union. So, obviously, and that's one of like the things that people say is like, if they didn't industrialize the country, how would they have defeated the Nazis? That's what people always say. It's like they're trying to like it's kind of like when people like justify being a piece of shit because incidentally their shitty behavior led to some kind of other positive outcomes. If I didn't do this bad thing, then this good thing wouldn't have happened. Something like that. Anyway, at various stages I'll reread that sentence. The struggle to raise the productivity of labor, together with concern about defense, is the fundamental content of the activity of the Soviet government. At various stages in the evolution of the Union, this struggle has assumed various characters. The methods applied during the years of the first 5-year plan and the beginning of the second, the methods of, quote, shock brigadism, were based upon agriculture, personal example, administrative pressure, and all kinds of group encouragements and privileges. The attempt to introduce a kind of piecework payment on the basis of the, quote, 6 conditions of 1931 came to grief against the spectral character of the valuta and the heterogeneity of prices. It's generally regarded as the implementation of piecework within capitalist society's context being a very hostile introduction with it against the working class. But when it's applied under Stalinism, it's somehow progressive. For it encourages egoism and atomism and a competition as opposed to cooperation within the workplace, making organizing for collective demands for the betterment of the working class difficult. That's how it's generally conceived, to my understanding, within capitalist countries in terms of critiques of the capitalist labor process. But then that very hated system was implemented with full vigor in the Soviet Union, both in, not just in, the so-called capitalist times of the new economic policy, not so-called, they were capitalist times of the new economic policy, but also in the Stalin period. The attempt to introduce a kind of piecework payment on the basis of the, quote, 6 conditions of 1931 came to grief against the spectral character of the valuta and the heterogeneity of prices. The system of state distribution of products had replaced the flexible differential valuation of labor with a so-called, quote, premium system, end quote, which meant, in essence, bureaucratic caprice. In the strife for copious privileges, there appeared in the ranks of shock brigades an increasing number of chiselers with special pull. In the long run, the whole system came into complete opposition with its own aims. Yeah, that scene in Gangs of New York where Leonardo DiCaprio is talking to the bald guy and he's like, "You calling us chiselers?" That's that's what that made me think of. Only the abolition of the card system, the beginning of stabilization, and the unification of prices created the conditions for the application of piecework payment. Upon this basis, shock brigadism was replaced with the so-called Stakhanov Movement. In the chase after the ruble, which had now acquired a very real meaning, the workers began to concern themselves more about their machines and make a more careful use of their working time. The Stakhanov movement, to a degree, comes down to an intensification of labor and even to a lengthening of the working day. During the so-called, quote, non-working time, the Stakhanovists put their benches and tools in order and sort their raw material. The brigadiers instruct their brigades, etc. Of the 7-hour working day, there thus remains nothing but the name. It was not the Soviet administrators who invented the secret of piecework payment, that system which strains the nerves without visible external compulsion. Marx considered, quote, the most suitable to capitalistic methods of production, end quote. There you are. Marx said it himself. My earlier comments about what the meaning of piecework under capitalism. It's verified by the man himself, the big cheese. The workers greeted his innovation not only without sympathy, but with hostility. It would have been unnatural to expect anything else of them. The participation in the Stakhanov movement of the genuine enthusiast of socialism is indubitable. To what extent they exceed the number of mere careerists and cheaters, especially in the sphere of administration, it would be hard to say, but the main mass of the workers approaches the new mode of payment from the point of view of the ruble, and is often compelled to perceive that it is getting shorter. Although at first glance the return of the Soviet government after, quote, the final and irrevocable triumph of socialism, end quote, to piecework payment might seem a retreat to capitalist relations, in reality it is necessary to repeat here what was said about the rehabilitation of the ruble. It is not a question of renouncing socialism, but merely of abandoning crude illusions. The form of wage payment is simply brought into better correspondence with the real resources of the country. Quote, law can never be higher than the economic structure, end quote. I want to repeat that sentence, that last little paragraph, because I feel like it's important. In relation to the question of whether the Soviet Union can be described as a degenerated worker state, bureaucratic, collectivist, or state capitalist. Although at first glance the return of the Soviet government after, quote, the final and irrevocable triumph of socialism, end quote, to piecework payment might seem a retreat to capitalist relations, in reality it is necessary to repeat here what was said about the rehabilitation of the ruble. It is not a question of renouncing socialism, but merely of abandoning crude illusions. The form of wage payment is simply brought into better correspondence with the real resources of the country. Quote, law can never be higher than the economic structure, end quote. However, the ruling stratum of the Soviet Union cannot yet get along without a social disguise. In a report to the Central Executive Committee in January 1936, the president of the State Planning Commission, Kulak, said, quote, "The ruble is becoming the sole means for the realization of a socialist principle for payment of labor." End quote. Although in the old monarchy, everything, even down to public pissiers, what the fuck is that? P-I-S-S-I-O-R. It's misspelled. It's not pissiers. I think it's pissoirs. Actually are pissers. Like fucking like public toilets. Although in the old monarchy everything, even down to the public pissoirs, was called royal, this does not mean that in a worker state everything automatically becomes socialist. The ruble is the quote sole real means, end quote, for the realization of a capitalist principle of payment for labor, even though on a basis of socialist forms of property. This contradiction is already familiar to us in instituting the new myth of a, quote, socialist piecework payment. Meslauk added, quote, "The fundamental principle of socialism is that each one's work according to his abilities and receives payment according to the labor performed by him." End quote. I mean, that does actually sound like actually what the type of lower phase of communism. That's actually what's meant by like bourgeois principles of right, receiving payment according to labor performed. And in terms of like obviously, you know, the piecework payment is would not be under the Soviet bloc, would not be an instance of that, but yeah. And then Trotsky says, "Those gentlemen are certainly not diffident in manipulating theories." That's true. "When the rhythm of labor is determined by the chase after the ruble, then people do not expend themselves, quote, according to ability, end quote, that is, according to the condition of their nerves and muscles, but in violation of themselves. This method can only be justified conditionally and by reference to stern necessity. To declare it, quote, the fundamental principle of socialism, end quote, means cynically to trample the idea of a new and higher culture in the familiar filth of capitalism." Stalin has taken one more step on this road, presenting the Stakhanov Movement as a, quote, preparation for the conditions of the transition from socialism to communism, end quote. The reader will see now how important it may be to give a scientific direction to those notions which are employed in the Soviet Union according to administrative convenience. Socialism, or the lower stage of communism, demands, to be sure, a strict control of the amount of labor and the amount of consumption. But it assumes in any case more human forms of control than those invented by the exploitative genius of capital. I don't know about the notion of it being the lower stage of communism being characterized by strict control of labor and the amount of consumption. That seems adding an authoritarian spin to the lower stage of communism, which is not present in Marx. Anyway, Socialism, or the lowest stage of communism, demands, to be sure, a strict control of the amount of labor and the amount of consumption, but it assumes in any case more humane forms of control than those invented by the exploitive genius of capital. In the Soviet Union, however, there is now taking place a ruthlessly severe fitting in of backward human material to the technique borrowed from capitalism. In the struggle to achieve European and American standards, the classic methods of exploitation, such as piecework payment, are applied in such naked and crude forms as would not be permitted even by reformist trade unions in bourgeois countries. The considerations that the Soviet Union, the workers work, quote, for themselves, end quote, is true only in historical perspective and only on condition. We will anticipate ourselves to say that workers do not submit to the saddle of an autocratic bureaucracy. In any case, state ownership of the means of production does not turn manure into gold and does not surround with a halo of sanctity the sweatshop system, which wears out the greatest of all productive forces, man. As to the preparation of a, quote, transition from socialism to communism, end quote, that will begin at exactly the opposite end, not with the introduction of piecework payment, but with piecework payment's abolition as a relic of barbarism. It's interesting how, despite clearly understanding how exploitative and violent the Soviet state is to the direct producers and the population, Trotsky could ever, I don't know how you could hold on to the degenerated worker state thesis. I really don't. It seems like the relations of production being described here, which, based upon any Marxist analysis of society, the social base, the everyday relations of production, broadly conceived, right here, are clearly that hostile to the working class in a fundamental way, in a structural way, not in an offhand way, and the power between the bureaucracy, the direct producers, and the bureaucracy, not just the bureaucracy, but the state as such, is openly confessed to. But at the same time, it's a worker state strictly on the basis of the nationalization of property. And this, to my understanding, this will lead Orthodox Trotskyists, to my understanding, to just assume that states such as East Germany, for instance, are worker states on the basis that private property has become nationalized, regardless of the actual inner social content of that. And it's also consistent with that is the inability to believe that something can be anti-capitalist and reactionary at the same time, which is kind of like the crux of bureaucratic collectivist thesis, is that Stalinism and the Stalinist system were both anti-bourgeois and anti-proletarian. And so that it makes theoretical room for something to be both anti-capitalist and non-emancipatory. Which is something that Stalinists and Orthodox Trotskyists seem to be very much in agreement upon. Instead of something's anti-capitalist, then it's in some sense progressive. Without, lots of other extreme, very strong caveats being made. Anyway, new section. It is still early to cast the balance of the Stakhanov movement, but it is already possible to distinguish certain traits characteristic not only of the movement but of the regime as a whole. Certain achievements of individual workers are undoubtedly extremely interesting as evidence of the possibilities open only to socialism. However, from these possibilities to their realization on the scale of the economy as a whole is a long road. With the close dependence of one productive process upon another, a continual high output cannot be the result of mere personal efforts. The evaluation of the average productivity cannot be achieved without a reorganization of production both in the separate factory and in the relations between enterprises. Moreover, to raise millions to a small degree of technical skill is immeasurably harder than to spur on a few thousand champions. The leaders themselves, as we have heard, complain at times that the Soviet workers lack skill. However, that is only half of the truth and the smaller half. The Russian worker is enterprising, ingenious, and gifted, and any 100 Soviet workers transferred into the conditions, let us say, of American industry after a few months and even weeks would probably not fall behind the American workers as a corresponding category. The difficulty lies in the general organization of labor. The Soviet administrative personnel is, as a general rule, far less equal to the new productive tasks than the worker. With a new technique, piecework payment should inevitably lead to a systematic raising of the now very low productivity of labor. But the creation of the necessary elementary conditions for this demands a raising of the level of administration itself, from the shop foreman to the leaders in the Kremlin. The Stakhanov movement only in a very small degree meets this demand. The bureaucracy tries fatally to leap over difficulties which it cannot surmount. Other piecework payment of itself does not give the immediate miracles expected of it. A furious administrative pressure rushes it to its help, with premiums and ballyhoos on the one side and penalties on the other. The meaning of a ballyhoo is a noisy, attention-getting demonstration or talk. Or flamboyant, exaggerated, or sensational promotion or publicity. The first steps of the movement were signalized with mass repressions against the technical engineering personnel and the workers accused of resistance, sabotage, and in some cases even of the murder of Stakhanovists. The severity of repressions testifies to the strength of the resistance. The boss explained this so-called, quote, sabotage as a political opposition. In reality, it was most often rooted in technical, economic, and cultural difficulties, a considerable portion of which found their source in the bureaucracy itself. The, quote, sabotage was soon apparently broken. The discontented were frightened, the perspicuous were silenced. Telegrams flew around about unheard-of achievements, and in reality, so long as it was a question of individual pioneers, the local administrators, obedient to orders, arranged their work with extraordinary forethought, although at the expense of the other workers in the mine or guild. But when hundreds of thousands of workers are suddenly numbered among, quote, Stakhanovists, the administration gets into utter confusion, not knowing how and not being objectively able to put the regime of production in order in a short space of time. The regime tries to violate both labor power and technique. When the clockworks slow down, it pokes the little wheels with a nail. As a result of the, quote, Stakhanovist days and 10-day periods, complete chaos was introduced into many enterprises. This explains the fact at first glance astonishing that a growth in the number of Stakhanovists is frequently accompanied not with an increase but a decrease in the general productivity of the enterprise. At present, the, quote, heroic period of the movement is apparently past. The everyday grind begins. It is necessary to learn. Those especially have much to learn with who teach others. But they are just the ones who least of all wish to learn. The name of that social guild which holds back and paralyzes all the guilds of the Soviet economy is the bureaucracy. It's the end of chapter 4. I was just going to say that if you're curious about Stakhanovism or interested in it, I would highly recommend the film. There's 2 films actually by a Polish director from the 1970s and 80s. I think these movies are made. The first one's called Man of Marble, and I think the next one's called Man of Iron. But these are kind of about, it's a weird thing. It's about like a investigative journalist within like the Polish press under communism, or maybe a graduate student doing a thesis. I can't remember, but she was very interested in this particularly like high profile like Stakhanovite kind of figure within the reconstruction after World War II in Poland. And but he kind of he falls foul of the regime and is kind of for whatever reasons, after being an idealist communist, kind of falls foul of the regime, not in I don't remember to in a reactionary way, but in a independent kind of socialist way, working class way. Obviously he was pro working class. But it's a very the tremendous movie, both of them, and it's kind of just about, I don't know, the contradictions of socialism in Poland, or quote socialism in Poland. I'd really recommend them. I don't know what other movies this guy has made, but those 2 movies are good. I think he might have went on to be a Hollywood director later, lived in America, left Poland. And if those movies are any indication, I mean, I don't know what their release history is, but it's if that movie is any indication of what the press would allow in Poland at that time, that betrays a certain liberalness, I think, in terms of part of the authorities, because the movie's very, very critical, socially critical, not of the system that was existing in Poland. And I think you could say the same thing about some other films. Maybe I can't really think of any Russian films that are like that, but I think also the movie W.R. The Mysteries of the Organism, which is about Wilhelm Reich, and sexual revolution, and I don't know, I think it's part of the Black Wave movement in Yugoslavia. If that movie was actually got funding and circulation within Yugoslavia, I can't really imagine a movie that was as devastatingly critical of the status quo as that movie. Can't really think of anything that would be comparable in the United States. The only one that I can think of, I think, might have actually been, in fact, banned, which was like Salt of the Earth, which is an interesting historical piece, but I don't know if it's a tremendous movie. But it is tremendously interesting insofar as Salt of the Earth, which is like made by like, I don't know, a certain section of like the miners union in like, but it's about like miners in like New Mexico or something, somewhere like that, Southwest somewhere. And it's so actually probably the most intense feminist film that I've ever seen. I think as a film about the exploitation and exclusion of women as housewives is put on full display in this movie and is made explicit in the movie, and the battles between husband and wife over a woman's entitlement to freedom and participation in social life is tremendous. Phenomenal movie in a lot of ways. Primitive, not like experts, but like a very important movie. Sometimes you watch a movie and it's just like, it's not like, you're kind of like watching it to like, for like appreciation, as opposed to like getting sucked into like the drama. But it's a good movie. I recommend Salt of the Earth. The movies I was talking about earlier about Stakhanovism were Man of Iron and Man of Marble, I think is that called. There might have been another one, but I'm not sure. Those are the ones I know. Anyway, Andre Vajda, which is like, I think his last name's pronounced like, I can't even spell his name because Andre's spelled weird, but I think the last name is like Vajda. But it's sick. Check it out. Thanks for listening.